Perhaps I should begin with an apology, because some of you may have read the notice for this meeting and might have been expecting a discussion about the minimum wage, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. But because we're edging towards a provincial election, one that may be a watershed election, I wanted to put on a little bit of a different hat. And so while I am here as president of the Alberta Federation of Labour and a labour advocate and activist, I'm here also as a member and a leader in Alberta Progressive Civil Society. And I wanted to talk to you about the concerns that we have in the labour movement, and I think they're concerns that increasingly are shared by other progressive people around the province about some troubling trends that we're seeing starting to develop and play out on the political landscape. In particular, what we're starting to see, and what I'm afraid we're going to see a lot more of as we move towards the next provincial election, is the introduction of strategies that have now become sadly familiar south of the border, used by politicians like this guy, the President of the United States, Donald Trump. And he has become a master in the use of what some people have described as post-truth strategies in politics. By post-truth, I mean the increasing willingness on behalf of politicians and political parties to shamelessly use mistruths as a vehicle of persuasion. I know some of you might say, well, politicians always lie, or at least bend the truth. I'll concede that that certainly is the reputation of politicians, and it has been the practice. Politicians make promises, they don't always follow through. But what we've seen with Donald Trump, and what I'm afraid we're seeing increasingly here in Alberta, especially with parties like the United Conservative Party, the UCP, and its leader, Jason Kenney, is a willingness to go beyond bending the truth and a willingness to actually embrace what I would describe as a post-truth strategy. In fact, what Donald Trump has been so successful with, and what we think the UCP and Jason Kenney are flirting with, is a strategy for persuasion, and that's a gentle term, that was actually developed and implemented by Russian spy masters. And what you see on the screen is the title of a study written by policy analysts at the RAND Corporation, which is a big think tank in the States. They talk about the strategy that has been used so successfully by the Russians to intervene in democratic elections in places like the United States. We've seen similar strategies unfold in places like France and in the UK. And the strategy that they use has been given the term firehood of falsehoods. It's a propaganda model that basically is designed with shamelessly using untruths, not even trying, to tell the truth, but flooding people with it. And the distinctive features of this strategy, and I think a lot of us sadly are familiar with them, include high volume and multi-channel repetition, continuous, repetitive, rapid repetition of messages, and it's a strategy that lacks commitment to objective reality, and it lacks a commitment to consistency. You'd think that because this strategy is so blatant, it would be unsuccessful, but we've seen south of the border that it actually can be successful. And one of the reasons that it is because, frankly, a lot of people don't have time to double check. So first impressions are very powerful, they're very resilient, and the repetition of the message even if it's based on a falsehood, leads to familiarity, and familiarity leads to acceptance. So, unfortunately, as president of the Federation of Labor, I'm a political animal. I am an elected politician in the labor movement. I'm the chief lobbyist for unions in this province. And so I spend a lot of time, in the old days I spent a lot of time outside the legislature. Now that we have a progressive government, I spend a lot of time inside the legislature because we have a government that's willing to sit down and consult with the labor movement. But I've been an observer of politics in Alberta for a long time, and I'm troubled with what I see. And I'm going to make the bold assertion that we have one party in this province that has either unconsciously, but I would say it's consciously, adopted this Firehose of falsehood propaganda model as the central part of their approach to politics. So, reading over the RAND document, they say that this kind of strategy is effective, but they also go on to say that the only way you can counteract it is by calling it out, by naming the strategy, saying we know what you're doing, and then doing your best to try to debunk all the lies that are put out in an effort to sort of bend people's minds towards one candidate or another. So what I'd like to do today is to reverse the fire hose, okay? And by that I mean I want to meet what I would describe as a fire hose of falsehoods coming from the UCP and Jason Kenney, and turn a fire hose of truth on those falsehoods. And I'm going to have to, because of the time constraints, I'm going to have to run through it. But this actually serves the purpose, and because once you see my list, because what I'm going to do for you right now is present you with some of the things that all of us have heard from Jason Kenney, presented as fact, designed to undermine confidence in the current government and presumably increase support for the UCP and their candidates. But we've all heard these things presented as fact. And we hear them over and over again. Sometimes we hear them multiple times from multiple sources in the same day. And some of them, even if you're progressive in your political leanings, you may not have questioned them. But what I'm going to do is give you a rapid fire fire hose of alternative information to what you often hear from Jason Kenney. And I will I'm going to be blunt about this. There's argument in politics, but this is beyond argument and perspective, okay? So let's start with the first thing that we hear from people like Jason Kenney. The first thing that we often hear is that the recession that we've just emerged from is the result of government policy. And I'll just draw your attention to this chart, is a chart of oil prices. This is not a hard one for me to convince people of, okay? The real economic challenge faced by this province is not the result of any policy implemented by the current government. It is the direct result of the precipitous decline, collapse, I would even say, in the price of oil from over $110 a barrel to only about $25 a barrel in the course of less than a year. And I would submit to you that any government, regardless of their political stripe, would have struggled in the same kind of situation, especially when you consider that, depending how you define it, about 40% of our provincial GDP is driven by the oil and gas sector. So when you see the primary driver of the economy, the thing that sector of the economy is buying and selling, the price declines that quickly, regardless of your political stripe, regardless of the policies that you embrace, you're going to have a problem. So I don't know how many times people have heard the economy in Alberta being described as disastrous, right? How many times have you heard that in the last 6 months? Heck, maybe even in the last week, right? But Nothing could be further from the truth. This is a list of forecasts for Alberta's economic growth from credible economic sources. So Scotiabank, Bank of Montreal, Royal Bank, Alberta Treasury Branch, TD, the Conference Board. They all agree that the Alberta economy will grow at a rate that far exceeds the growth in any other province. So I'll repeat that. Despite the fact that people like Jason Kenney are saying that the economy is disastrous, we are growing at a rate in excess of any other province in the country. Just to further illustrate the point, this is a graph that maps out retail sales. And you can see that the retail sales did suffer during the recession, but they're going up, and they're going up much faster than most economists had projected. And in fact, retail sales in Alberta right now are at a higher level than they were before the collapse of oil prices and before the recession began. Similarly, wholesale trade in Alberta has recovered and is now is above where it was before the price of oil dropped. And just to put it in another perspective, so yes, Alberta economy is growing, and someone might say, well, it only seems like a rapid growth because it had been shrinking. So what are the absolute numbers? This graph shows GDP per capita for 2017 by province. And what you can see is that there is no province in the country that has a higher gross domestic product per person than Alberta. And that is basically the definition of wealth, okay? And this is not for, 2014 or the end of the Conservative era. This is for Alberta in 2017. Similarly, if you want to look at another measure of our economic health, you can look at statistics on personal income per capita. And what this chart shows is personal wealth, personal income for a number of cities across the country, not just in Alberta, but our two big cities, Calgary and Edmonton, lead the pack in terms of personal income per capita. And in fact, when it comes to personal income per capita in Calgary, literally no other city in the entire country comes even close. And once again, these are numbers for 2017 when we were still struggling to emerge from recession. So we've heard lies about the true state of our economy. We've also heard lies and misrepresentations about certain government policies, and I'll go through a few of them. The minimum wage is one. So we've heard over and over again that a minimum wage increase is not necessary because the only people working for minimum wage are teenagers living in their parents' basement and not paying room or board, and only needing money to pay for things like CDs and vacations. Nothing could be further from the truth. The reality is that before the New Democrats became government, we had, despite our prosperity, we had the lowest minimum wage in the country, and the people who were struggling to make ends meet on that amount or close to it were not teenagers living with their parents. They were adults, many of them with post-secondary degrees. The majority of them were women. A lot of them were working full-time, not going to school, and many of them had dependents. And so what the low minimum wage meant was that they lived in poverty, plain and simple. Similarly, there are a lot of people, and you've heard this over and over again, that the minimum wage increase is killing jobs. How many times have you heard that? Now, if it were true that the minimum wage was actually killing jobs, you would see it reflected in the numbers. And I'll tell you, as a labor leader who follows labor market information on a regular basis, there has been no collapse in employment, and especially when it comes to employment in those sectors where the minimum wage has actually been increasing most. So, you know, the food service sector, other low-wage service sectors, and the other group, and this is what this slide shows you, is employment rates for young workers, people between the ages of 15 and 24. Now, we've been sort of living with a sort of a real-time experiment here in Alberta and our neighbor in Saskatchewan. Now, we increased our minimum wage to something closer to a living wage, or at least we're in the process of doing that. Saskatchewan, where they have a more conservative government, did not. Now, if it were true that that the minimum wage kills jobs, you would expect to see employment for young workers go down in Alberta and either go up or stay the same as Saskatchewan. But that is not what happened. And so what this chart shows is it shows you when the minimum wages were increased in Alberta, and you can see that our labor markets for young workers are virtually identical, which is what you would expect because our economies are very similar, both being based on oil and gas. The next thing I'll point out, and this may seem a little esoteric, this is a, you know, people say, well, it's a big increase. It's a big increase, you know, 50% increase over a short period of time. But what this shows is what economists talk about being the optimal minimum wage. They say a minimum wage should be set at about 50% of the median. That's the best, you know, like, that's the best place to set a minimum wage, 50% of the median. Guess what the median in Alberta is? We have the highest median wage in the country still, and it is $30 an hour. So by bringing our minimum wage up to $15 an hour, we're just bringing it up to where economists say it should be. And interestingly, that's where almost all the minimum wages in other provinces already were. So even though we're going to have the highest minimum wage in nominal terms at $15 an hour as a percentage of the median, we're literally catching up to the rest of the country just now. I'm just going to move along because I'm conscious that I have an awful lot of slides. Another thing that you've heard, that government policies like the minimum wage and the carbon tax will result in inflation, right? And you know, these kind of arguments have what the comedian Stephen Colbert used to talk. He called it truthiness. It sounds true. It sounds like it might be true, but it's not. Okay, so when businesses say, "Oh, if we increase the minimum wage, it's going to lead to rapid inflation," well, you can say that, but let's actually look at the numbers. And what this chart shows is inflation rates over the last year in Alberta when we've increased the minimum wage. And what it shows is that we actually have the lowest rate of inflation in the country. So the minimum wage has not led to inflation of any sort in Alberta. Another argument that you've heard over and over, and it's repeated as if it were true, and I would argue that it is an example of this post-truth political strategy that I talked about off the top, is that Alberta and the NDP government in this province, through their policies, is driving away investment. How many times have people, this is one of those things that even progressives sometimes believe, okay, because they haven't seen the numbers to refute it. But here they are, okay? So what this chart shows is capital spending per capita by province. And what you see, Alberta's over there on my left-hand side, your right-hand side. And the red is oil and gas spending, the blue is everything else. And what you see is that we lead the country in terms of per capita business investment. Business investment. This is not public sector investment. This is business investment. The only province that has a higher per capita rate of business investment is Newfoundland, and that's because they also have oil and they have a tiny population. That's the only reason, right? So our level of business investment is literally triple. Under a new Democratic government, it's literally triple the level of business investment in places like Ontario and Quebec, okay? So that puts that in perspective. Here's another argument that we've heard over and over again. And how many I would actually say that people in this room have probably even heard this argument today, that NDP policies are killing the oil and gas sector. We're killing the golden goose. That's one of those things that someone like Jason Kenney can say, and he gets away with it because it has that air of truthiness, okay? People assume that it's true because, you know, there's this stereotype about the New Democrats being anti-oil and gas. But once again, despite its air of truthiness, this is an example of an argument that does not bear out when you actually look at the numbers. What this chart shows is the year-over-year change in drilling activity in 3 of the western provinces that actually have oil and gas. And what you see is that drilling activity is up in BC, it's up in Alberta, and in Saskatchewan, which is supposed to be the poster child for those people on the right side of the political spectrum because it's led by Brad Wall and the Saskatchewan Party, somehow their drilling activity is shrinking while ours, with a New Democrat government, is growing. So I'm not going to suggest that the New Democrats, through their policies, should take credit for all of that. I'm just saying that you can't say that they are driving away investment because the statistics show otherwise. Similarly, another argument that we've heard over and over again, repeated ad nauseum, is that the NDP and their policies here in Alberta are driving investment in oil and gas away from Alberta to other parts of North America, in particular the United States. Okay, and I've just been given the 5-minute warning, so I'm gonna have to move kind of quickly here. But this is an important one because this is an argument that we've heard over and over, right? We've heard over and over that investment is being driven out of the province. What this chart shows is oil and gas spending, capital spending in Canada, which is largely like 75% of oil and gas spending is spent right here in Alberta. So it's comparing oil and gas capital expenditure between Canada and the United States since January 2014. And what you'll see is that investment declined, but it declined everywhere, and it declined everywhere equally. And it was really about price. It wasn't about royalty policy. It wasn't about carbon taxes. It was about the price of the product. When the price is high, companies invest. When the price is low, they pull back. And that was true whether it was Alberta, Saskatchewan, and in this chart what it shows is that the same thing happened in the United States. In fact, what we're seeing right now is a dramatic increase in spending here in Alberta. Spending is ramping up in the oil patch, and I'm running out of time. But and my fire, I actually haven't been aiming my fire hose at you fast enough. But what I can do when we because we're gonna wrap up this portion. We're going to have lunch, we'll have a Q&A, and I can, in response to your questions, I can talk about some of the other lies and half-truths and mistruths that are being told over and over again that are distorting the conversation that we as Albertans are having in advance of the next election. And I'm just going to, I'm not going to go, you can see how many slides I have. I'm going to go to my last slide, oops, and wrap up. And I'm going to say, what is our task? What is our task as civil society? Well, our task as members of civil society, as people who believe that democracy requires truth, our first task is to expose these post-truth tactics. It is the best defense against the use of these tactics and their influence on the process of the election and the outcome of the election. So we have to, let people know that this is happening, and so that they can be more skeptical when they hear arguments that perhaps don't jibe with what they think or what they know. Second, we need to reject the politicians and parties who use these tactics, and we need to do that because we have to stop the spread of these kind of politics, the kind of politics that frankly has become a cancer south of the border. We have to stop those kind of politics and those kind of strategies from coming north across the border. And finally, we actually have to start asking ourselves, what are the real problems facing Alberta today, and which parties are best suited, best positioned, and most committed to dealing with them. Things like climate change, which party is most likely to do their part to address climate change. Things like inequality, which party is best positioned and most committed to address those things. And even things like revenue reform to pay for our public services. Because, you know, the big issue that, and I would argue the only issue where the New Democrats are struggling is that issue of the deficit. And I had charts on that. But, you know, the deficit is the result of the collapse in the price of oil, first. But second, and perhaps more importantly, it is the result of decisions made by previous governments in this province to undermine the revenue base that we need to pay for our public services. So starting with Ralph Klein, we saw a steady erosion of tax revenue because they were giving successive tax breaks to wealthy people, to corporations, to the point where Alberta now collects only about 11% of our economy, of our provincial GDP, to pay for public services, compared to about 20% in every other province. That wasn't always the case. When Peter Lougheed was premier, we were closer to 20%. Even when Ralph Klein himself balanced the budget, he had a progressive tax system, and he was closer to 20% of GDP. So it was political choices that broke the revenue system that we needed to pay for our public services. The only way that governments after Ralph Klein were able to balance the budget was by using resource revenue to help fill that gap. Now that the price of oil is down, resource revenue is dried up, there is a hole, and almost like there's a $10 billion deficit. Almost that entire $10 billion had been covered by royalty revenue. So if we had a tax system that looked more like Saskatchewan, even, almost all of that would disappear. So, that's our final task, is to figure out what are the real problems as opposed to the ones that are made up for us. What are the real challenges, and which parties are best suited to actually address those problems, and which, do we know in our hearts, won't even touch them. So thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to the lunch, and I also look forward to the Q&A session. Thank you.